And together, we will move mountains. And if they don't hear our message, then we'll just do it over and over and over and over 1,000 times again for you. And I'll rise up, I'll rise like the day, I'll rise up in spite of the I will rise, we will rise, we will rise, we will rise.
Hello, my name is Michelle Zabel, and I'm an assistant dean at the University of Maryland School of Social Work and the proud director of the Institute for Innovation and Implementation. So this year of working virtually has necessitated some really creative approaches to conferences. For us, we've spread the Training Institute workshops over the last 9 months, hosting just a few workshops each month. And I want to thank you for joining in these discussions and participating each month. This summer, we're continuing the Training Institutes in a way that will allow you to take us wherever you go. And I am hopeful that you are able to take a break and get away safely. We're going to be recording our summer workshops and releasing them each month so you can watch them anytime during the month that works for you. These workshops are going to be on a wide range of topics, all focused around strengthening your skills as you support children, youth, and families. A quick note, some presentation reference information and graphics that are embedded within the presentations may not be fully explained within the audio, but all of the presentations are accessible to download, as well as the resources and handouts that correspond to each workshop, and I encourage you to do that. Thank you for listening to the audio recordings of our summer workshops for Training Institutes Live. While you're enjoying these summer months and workshops, we'll be planning and working towards future Training Institutes when hopefully we can all see each other in person. Take care, enjoy your summer. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to implementing intensive home-based treatment for the Training Institutes Live. And my name is Rick Shepler, and I'm from the Center for Innovative Practices at Case Western Reserve University. And joining me today.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amina Smith. I'm the Evidence-Based Practices Program Manager here from the DC Department of Behavioral Health, joining Dr. Shepler.
So we're excited to be here. We're going to talk today about the Intensive Home-Based Treatment Program and Practice Standards. These are standards that were developed in collaboration with the University of Maryland and the University of Washington and a few other folks. And we're going to go over the main components of them. And there will also be the actual handout of the program and the practice standards made available to you. So as we begin, let's start with just a basic definition and just a comment about intensive home-based treatment. There are a lot of different names used in every state that talk about this service. Some of the states call it intensive in-home. Some of them might use a totally different name like intensive family-based or something like that. For the purpose of today's workshop, we're just going to call it intensive home-based treatment. And the definition is an intensive, time-limited mental health service for youth with serious mental health conditions and their families. That is provided in the home, school, and community where the youth lives with the goal of stabilizing their mental health concerns and safely maintaining the youth in the least restrictive, most normative environment. So as you can see right off the bat, these are services that fit really nicely within a complete system of care for youth and families. These services include a comprehensive set of therapeutic and rehabilitative services that are integrated by a team of providers into a seamless set of services delivered to the family. Intensive home-based treatment has, over the years, really targeted reunifying kids from placement, but also preventing youth from going to more restrictive placement. And it's also used for stabilization of youth in terms of if they're having any current, safety issues related to their behavioral health conditions. We believe that intensive home-based treatment occupies a critical place in the service array provided by systems of care for children, youth, and young adults with mental health challenges. And IHBT is the most intensive home and community-based treatment service available prior to considering more restrictive options. I want to go over a brief history of home-based interventions in the United States anyway. Home Builders is the very first intensive home-based model developed in 1974 out of the state of Washington. It was targeted for youth involved in child welfare who are at risk of abuse and neglect. This was the very first home-based program, and most of the home-based programs that exist in other states now utilize Home Builders' core intensive home-based service delivery model. They began with a 4 to 6 week, very intensive two-person case load, if you will, or family load. And they would serve each youth and family, up to 10 hours per week. So as you can see, it was a very, very intensive model and very short term, very brief. The other models that were developed in other states followed probably about 10 years after that. In the mid 80s is when there was an influx of state-developed intensive home-based treatment models where they incorporated a mental health treatment intervention into that core service delivery model that Home Builders created. And I'll go over that here in the next slide. But for example, we have programs in Alabama and Connecticut with their ICAPS program. We have CVI 2 and 3 out of the District of Columbia, which Amina will be talking about here shortly. And as you can see, I don't need to go through all of these, but these are some of the programs in some of the states, but there are many others. So many states develop their own programming. Multisystemic therapy was the first program that was heavily researched, beginning probably around 1986 or so, and started getting implemented around 1990. More widely throughout the states, and now we know that it's fairly widely distributed throughout the states. It's really the evidence-based kind of gold standard for these kind of models, and it's geared toward working with youth involved in the juvenile justice system or youth that have externalizing behaviors that put them at risk of involvement in the juvenile justice system. What you're going to see with many of these programs is they've extended the length of stay from 4 to 6 weeks to more like 3 months to 5 months. It's still relatively brief, and we want it to continue to be small caseloads and very intensive, but not as intensive as the Home Builders model. And just a couple of years ago, we convened with the University of Washington and Eric Bruns and his colleagues, and some folks from Yale and Massachusetts, and convened to develop national standards for intensive home-based treatment. And what we're going to do today is go over those standards. What you're going to see in many of the programs that I just talked about is there are many similarities, but there are also some differences. So for example, the population of focus differs slightly between programs. As you can see with the multisystemic therapy program, their focus was mostly, juvenile justice. And some of the other programs focus on, substance use and juvenile justice, or just mental health, or the age range changes. There's slight differences in intensity, slight differences in, caseload location, credentials. Many of the states use a two-person team to deliver services, but just as many use a one-person clinician that can practice up and down to deliver all the services. And the level of research is there's quite a range for that. If the service was created at a university setting, chances are that there's going to be a higher level of research. If the program was created in the field, there's probably going to be a lower level of research that was completed on that program. So let's do a little comparison as I look at this chart, and as you look at this chart in front of you, you'll see that there are programs that are higher intensity, and there's a set of programs that have a range of intensity. And I just wanted to differentiate between them. As I said earlier, Home Builders is the most intensive model, and it's still out there. It's considered to be really kind of gold standard for family preservation programming. Then we also have in the middle of this chart, or the second column rather, all of these state homegrown models that are very well accepted within each of their states, and some of them have a lot of evidence behind them. ICAPS in particular, out of the state of Connecticut, has published quite a bit on their program. MST obviously is also an intensive program, but when you get to programs like functional family therapy or multidimensional family therapy, what you can see here is that these programs are delivered in some combination in the home and office, and their caseloads are just a little bit higher. There's a little bit of variation about being on call. So many of the high intensity programs listed on the left here, Home Builders, Intensive Home-Based Treatment, and MST, are all on call 24/7 to their families. And you start seeing a little bit of a difference with some of the range of intensity. The FFT and the MDFT programs, are based on a pure family therapy model. And because of that, they do look a little different, but they also have tremendous outcomes that are both considered evidence-based programs as well. As I mentioned earlier, today we're going to talk about the program and the practice standards that were developed. And there's more, the citation is here, listed below, and also in the reference section at the back end of the PowerPoint. The reason we wanted to do this is that we wanted to create more consistency in practice across states, across programs, so that if a family is receiving an intensive home-based treatment program in Iowa, it looks somewhat similar to that in Ohio or the District of Columbia. And it doesn't have to be identical, but we're looking for some consistency to be developed in both in the program standards, but also in the practice itself. In the program standards section of those program and practice standards, it's divided into categories of staffing and workforce development, some of the programmatic components. It discusses best practice for quality and accountability, talks about organizational supports, as well as supervision and oversight. So this is basically, what's the infrastructure need to look like to support a program like intensive home-based treatment. In the next slide, what you're going to see is a chart that talks in more detail about what are those main programmatic components. And I'll briefly go over these just to kind of set the tone for the rest of the workshop that we're going to be delivering. As stated earlier, this is a treatment service. It's delivered in the home and community. So intensive home-based programs are delivered, I would say 95% of the time or more in the home and community. Rarely are they delivered in an office setting, but you know, if there's an exception and you need to do that, it certainly is allowed. The intensity ranges from a frequency of about 2 to 5 sessions per week, depending on the needs of that youth and family, risk and safety issues that are happening, and the duration, usually 4 to 8 hours of total service per week. And you know, we're seeing an average of about 3 sessions of about 4 to 5 hours per week is kind of the average that we're seeing, but it fluctuates based on the phase of the treatment. It fluctuates, you know, based on also how many families that person is serving at that time as well, and the needs of the family, obviously. These programs are 24/7 available, so it doesn't mean that the provider, if it's a one-person team, is on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Usually there's some sort of rotation of coverage within the team itself. So you would have a person being on call, for example, Monday through Friday, and then on the weekend, somebody on the home-based team covers on call for the whole team. That's just an example of how it might play out. There's active safety planning and monitoring, and that's ongoing. We have small caseloads. You know, 4 to 6 families is the average per full-time employee. If it's a team of 2, that ranges more like 8 to 12 for a team of 2. You can serve a bit more folks with that. The flexible scheduling, any service, any meeting that we arrange, we want to make sure it's convenient to the family. We do not want to burden the family with something that is harder for them to attend, either for work or school and things like that. So many of our appointments are late afternoon, early evening. The treatment duration, as I mentioned earlier, is 3 to 6 months. One of the things that I've realized over the years is when we've looked at some of the outcome data for these kinds of programs, that the primary, gain that you're going to see in outcomes happens around 3 months, and you can see another increase in positive outcomes up to about 6 months. But after that, it really just plateaus. So the reason why we're involved at this fairly intensive level of care for youth, we can accomplish what we need to, usually within that 3 to 6 month period. And then transition to a less restrictive service. We do believe in systemic engagement and community teaming. Want to make sure it's a very collaborative service. One of the things that was interesting as we were developing these program standards was, well, how does this interface with, high fidelity wraparound or intensive care coordination? And my first response was interesting because, our service was developed like in the 80s, about the same time that wraparound was taking hold as well. But we realized there wasn't a whole lot of coordination and collaboration between, child serving systems that were helping the family. So in all of the home-based programs, they incorporated a large component dedicated to collaborative teaming and things like that. So now we're at a place of, okay, now how do we kind of divide and conquer and help each other out so that we're not duplicating important services the family will be getting. There's active clinical supervision and oversight with 24/7 availability of the supervisor, field support if needed, and individual and group supervision on a weekly basis. there's an intensity to the supervision, and we generally recommend a dedicated supervisor to the team. If we are, in fact, managing risk and safety issues for the community, there's an expectation that that's a very active monitoring process that includes, that dedicated oversight by the supervisor as well. Program structure and credentials, this ranges across the states, but we're looking for at least an individual licensed or a team of licensed and qualified behavioral health specialists to be working with the family. And then one of the hallmarks of intensive home-based treatment is that it is a comprehensive service array that's integrated into a seamless set of services to help the family and that youth get all of those things in one service. So crisis stabilization, safety planning, skill building, trauma responsive individual and family therapy interventions, resiliency and support building interventions. These are all things that are integrated into this very seamless treatment model to help families. So a little bit more on practitioner credentials, and then we'll move on to the next slide. But as a whole, that team, whether it's the CVI 2 and 3 teams in the district or the IHBT teams in Ohio, they have to have as a team the credentials that allow them to do behavioral health management, skills enhancement, individual family therapy. We often say that we're practicing up and down that mental health treatment continuum to help families do better. I want to talk about practitioner credentials, and again, the array of services that are included in intensive home base need to be covered in the scope of practice of the person or persons delivering that service. And that includes anything from individual and family therapy to crisis response and stabilization work, to skill enhancement work, etc. And as you can see here are some of the main components that you will see in most home-based service delivery models. It includes a multidimensional assessment, a comprehensive treatment array matched to needs and strengths. It also includes cross-system partnerships for helping families and youth, culturally mindful engagement and family partnerships, and a resiliency-oriented developmental perspective to promoting resilience in youth and families. So let's talk now about the practice standards, now that we've talked a little bit about the program standards. So the practice standards address what would be best practice for engagement, what would be best practice for identifying risk, safety planning, crisis response, assessment, conceptualization and treatment planning, best practices for comprehensive treatment, cross-system collaboration, advocacy, as well as what about resilience promotion and functional supports to help families and youth do better, as well as transitioning out of intensive home-based treatment. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these. So the first standard language that you'll see here that we'll talk about on the PowerPoint is, under engagement, the IHBT clinician demonstrates ability to establish a respectful, supportive, and validating partnership with youth and family members of varying ages, gender, race, sexual orientation, and ethnicities. They may implement motivational interviewing strategies based on the youth and family's change readiness. That engagement also needs to be culturally responsive. The IHBT clinician actively seeks to understand and demonstrate respect for the unique and diverse backgrounds of the youth and caregivers, roles, values, belief, ethnicities, race, sexual orientations, gender expressions, gender identities, languages, traditions, communities, and culture. So you can see it's a very comprehensively defined responsiveness.
Yes. So as we go further into the slides as well, we'll talk about the work in the district. But around 2015, we opened the opportunity for additional providers since we already were in the district or intensive home-based treatment, which we call community-based intervention services, was already in the district since 2004. But in 2015, around that time, and I'm sure prior to, it was just a gap where we were not able to reach our, our culturally and linguistically different families, our bilingual population, our Spanish-speaking population. So we opened up the opportunity for providers who can really display that they can reach that population and they have bilingual staff. So we were able to add additional providers and then increase our capacity for Spanish-speaking population. And we've been doing really well with that population since it is a growing population in the district. So I know we'll go more into detail later about our work in that, but that was one target that we've been doing over the past 6 years.
Thank you, Amina. This is a really good example of identifying that there was something that needed to be addressed, and then actually from a policy standpoint, changing a policy and then opening up new ability for other practitioners to come in to the district to serve them. So that was, really well done. Next on the practice standards is risk identification, safety planning, and crisis response. IHBT provider works with the youth and caregivers to identify and address risk and safety concerns at home, in the school, and in the community. So making sure that providers are good at identifying what are the concerns, what are the risk behaviors or the risk conditions that might impact that youth negatively or the family negatively, that we need to be really on top of in identifying. Safety planning is a major part of intensive home-based treatment. Again, I think about the words risk managers for the community. We want to focus on co-created safety plans that include, so these are done with the youth, in partnership with the youth and family, much like you'll see in mobile response stabilization service or high fidelity wraparound, this co-created partnering around what a safety plan should look like. It includes identification of safety concerns, crisis escalation, triggers and processes. What helps that youth do better? What helps that youth in terms of coping strategies to de-escalate? What are the actionable stabilization steps that need to be taken? And then, from a prevention standpoint, we want to help providers understand about risk mitigation, means reduction. How do we help that family and that youth create a level of safety in their home to help that youth, be able to stay in the home? Youth and caregiver identified supports are also put in the safety plan. As we train on safety planning, it's not one and done. It's not something you stick on a refrigerator. It's something that's regularly monitored and updated based on the youth and the needs of the family.
And I would echo that as well, even as we talked about, even in going into crisis response and stabilization. Safety planning, crisis response and stabilization are one of the things that we make sure we emphasize in the district. It is one thing that is a part of our components within Fidelity monitoring. And so we ensure that even through our process of trainings, which we offer on an annual basis, we ensure that we really look at these components of intensive home-based treatment and ensure that our staff or our teams are trained and that they really are echoing what Dr. Shepherd said, and saying that this is an ongoing tool that, you know, when a crisis does happen, are we revisiting the safety plan? And then also, are we really offering the crisis response and stabilization? So even throughout the pandemic, this was something that we really emphasized, and this was an example for us where we ensure that we have Fidelity monitoring going on annually, and that informs training, which informs ongoing consultation that is offered in the district to our providers.
Thank you, Amina, for that. And I think one of the things that the district does so well is it has this whole quality assurance feedback loop, and it looks at fidelity and how well the teams are doing, and that if there are any areas of concern or just in general patterns that we're seeing, that will be fed back into the training series for the next year, and what gets looked at in consultation and emphasized in consultation. So they do a great job with that. Crisis response and stabilization, we want to make sure that the IHBT clinician is the lead crisis responder in response to calls immediately and is available for on-site stabilization as appropriate. This has always been the case for intensive home-based treatment. And we believe strongly that, whoever knows the family best at the time the family is being served, that they should take a lead in crisis response. It becomes more and more important to define this as we get better as communities and states in developing our systems of care in our states. So if we have a more mature system of care, we'll probably have high fidelity wraparound intensive care coordination, mobile response stabilization services. And when you have more than one program that's able to and feels like they're responsible to respond to a crisis when it occurs for the family they're serving, you get confusion. And we want this to be really clear for the family. Who's that lead person? We just want to make it clear that when IHBT is involved, they go ahead and take the lead. Now, if the family feels that they would prefer to call a different provider, that's fine. Let's just clear that up so that the family knows who they're calling at the time that they need somebody to help them. Okay. Moving on to assessment, clinical conceptualization, and treatment planning. One of the hallmarks, again, of intensive home-based treatment is comprehensive contextual assessment. So we don't want to leave anything out that's important to consider, and what's driving, if you will, the current concerns and the needs of that youth or impacting that youth and that family. So what are those needs in current functioning? So we want to work with the youth and caregiver to comprehensively assess behavioral health needs and functioning across key life domains, much like you'll see in, for example, wraparound planning. And it's not much different than identifying those needs and strengths. We want to identify functional strengths when we want to assess for trauma, for the presence and impact of trauma, but also generational trauma as well. And really the core beating heart of intensive home-based treatment is that clinical conceptualization process. Many of the programs utilize something similar to a functional analysis to prioritize the most critical behaviors, behavioral health concerns, to conceptualize what the contributing factors might be, and then to match strategies and interventions to address those needs based on that array of services that we summarized earlier. So what does that comprehensive treatment look like? So here's what we use in Ohio, but also in the District of Columbia as a model to help us organize our thinking about and conceptualization of what's happening for that youth and family at that point in time. One of the things that I realized early on, I started doing intensive home-based as a direct care provider, was that it was an overwhelming feeling to me to be to try to help a family with multiple needs. Going into the home, I was inundated with information, whether it was sights or smells or dynamics or, and being a new clinician to the field, it was particularly even more so overwhelming. And I want to point out here that, with our current workforce issues, we're often hiring and, finding staff who are just coming out of their training programs. And so we're asking folks with the least amount of experience to work with youth and families with the highest needs. So it really becomes important to have some organizing framework for them to utilize to help them organize their treatment prior to, while they're working with the family. So this is just an example of that, and this is what I call the family need hierarchy that I shamelessly stole the idea from Maslow. So here, basically, it's developed on the concept that are there basic safety and stabilization needs that are occurring as you are meeting and working with the family? If so, that's where you have to begin. If there are no current safety and stabilization needs, does the youth and family have the skills that we're asking of them to implement? And if they don't have that skill set, then we need to help them learn what those skills could be. Ross Greene has a great set of quotes, but one of them is, children do well when they can. And I really, truly, believe in that philosophy. And if they can't, we need to teach either a developmental lagging skill set, or we need to build strategic accommodations for them to be more successful. And the same thing for families. We don't assume that they know how to do what we're asking. So you might have a judge or somebody, a judge or a magistrate basically saying, and you need to do this, this, and this. So there's an expectation that they're able to go ahead and do exactly what was just ordered. And we don't make that assumption. If the skills are there, then the question is, what other supports do they need? What family dynamics do we need to address so that they do better? What about the ecosystemic functioning of that youth at school, in the community, with peers? How can we help with that as well? And then ultimately, we want to be able to promote resilience in the life of that youth and family. So we're assessing at each step along the way. What are the safety needs? What are the skill set needs? What are the functional needs and life domains, including family? And then what kind of resilience promotion can we work on and or supports to help that youth and family do better over time? And this is just a short list of, when we say comprehensive treatment array matched to need, this is that diagram kind of mapped out a little bit with more specificity. And I'm not going to go over it, but just to show you that you have it as a reference when you go back and look at this. But you can see that, these home-based service delivery models don't necessarily prescribe one way of helping. They really want to bank on utilizing multiple evidence-based approaches, whether it's, emotional regulation, skill building, using, I don't know, DBT, for example, dialectical behavior therapy, or is it using more of a solution-focused family therapy approach to help that family to do better? Or they could be using, like in Pennsylvania, they use the structural family therapy approach. So it doesn't prescribe what to use. It assumes that it will use whatever that area of expertise that team wants to emphasize or the state wants to emphasize. And so you can pull these into the actual program model itself. In terms of the practice standards, skill building is a major part of that. And we want to build functional competencies and coping strategies for those youth and families. And these adaptive skills and strategies, we want them to occur across settings. I would say that the major ones we work on are emotional regulation and problem solving, and also communication and conflict management. But it could be a whole array of different developmental skill sets that you've identified based on that youth's needs that you need to work on so that you can help them. In the work, we also do cognitive behavioral interventions to look at some of the cognitive pieces and parts that might need addressed. So the IHBT clinician demonstrates competency in cognitive behavioral interventions, including assisting the youth in identifying underlying emotions, emotional triggers, and in developing cognitive flexibility, emotional regulation, and or adaptive thinking patterns. I just mentioned family and systemic interventions are also used. The most common one I would say in my training across the states is solution-focused. It's certainly malleable and it works. It's very portable in terms of implementing it within an intensive home-based treatment program, but also structural family therapy and strategic are also used. The clinician is able to track interactional sequences, identify non-adaptive relational patterns and systemic dynamics, and is able to develop and implement family system interventions that increase the family's adaptive responses and functioning. This is a skill set that I believe takes time, training, probably an extra supervision for a young clinician to master and to become competent at. Behavior management and positive parent-child relationships. So this is our code words for parenting. But it's, we want to use the words that Medicaid actually looks to use, which is behavior management. So the clinician demonstrates an ability to teach behavior management skills, including developmentally flexible parenting, things like consistency and follow through, use of meaningful consequences and rewards, etc. Again, we don't prescribe a particular version, but there are lots of good models of behavior management and parenting out there that have good evidence behind them that you could implement within the model itself. As I had mentioned earlier, collaborative planning and care coordination are critical to what we do, but we're going to do that in concert, in collaboration with high fidelity wraparound intensive care coordination. If that exists in the community that this program is being implemented in. If it's not, then we want to make sure that the IHBT program is doing some level of that coordination and planning with the youth and family. In terms of the contextual interventions, as I said earlier, if the youth struggles still to do, implement a set of skills that we've just taught, it may be that we just instead, or in addition, need to do some strategic accommodations for them, implement relational supports to help them be more successful at school, with peers, in the family. Okay, so it's not just about skill building, it's also about accommodations. What helps them do better? This is true of high fidelity wraparound, but it's also true of intensive home base, which is strategic advocacy. And that's my way of saying, being very thoughtful about how we help families navigate the system and help their children within the system that they're, struggling in at that time. Certainly we do proactive system advocacy, but we want to help the family be their own advocates within those systems. I've talked a lot about resilience up to this point, but what are those pro-social activities and peers that will help this youth do better? What are their interest areas? How do we promote those things? I think with the COVID over the last year, I think the one thing that concerned me as much as anything in terms of, many of our children not being in school was you also lost many of the extracurriculars that help, kids grow developmentally. So I'm excited to see that coming back, because our job is also to make sure that we're building protective factors and supporting those, developmental assets and a futures orientation for all the youth that we serve. And a lot of that is those pro-social activities, interests, sports, music, etc. And critically important is, how do we identify all the supports that the family might need or the youth might need to be successful once we leave? In terms of transition planning, it's also, the practice guidelines also have language about what is the best practice for transition planning. Okay, so just to summarize, that's a quick summary of the practice and program standards. And there's much, much more detail in the actual standards themselves, which we would encourage you to read, but we wanted to make sure we gave you that brief overview today. At this point, we're going to go ahead and have Amina Smith from the District of Columbia talk about implementing intensive home-based in DC.
Yeah, so we're excited. Just talk about just the work that we have been doing just in partnership with Case Western. So, just the history is that the model that we do use is intensive and home community-based services model. But however, we have an umbrella of our intensive home-based treatment called CBI, which is Community-Based Intervention Services. So 2004, this came into the district, the rules were written. There was a pilot with one of our larger agencies at the time, First Home Care. And so trainings were designed and implemented. And then additional providers were added and expanded in 2006. Then there was the trainer element added in 2007. And then, as we mentioned previously, in 2015 is when we made the decision to expand and add the opportunity or open the opportunity to increase access for linguistically and culturally competent providers and services. So around that time, we were able to really expand our reach to our bilingual families, specifically Spanish speaking. And then ongoing, we continue to partner with the Center of Innovative Practices, implementing the training curriculum, which also includes, not listed here, is fidelity monitoring, consultation, and just ongoing partnerships to ensure that we really provide the best service true to the fidelity of the model in the district. And so, with CBI 2 and 3, as we discussed what that is, really is still the same model of intensive home and community-based treatment, but at the same time, it's just the difference in we have authorizations for 6 months, or we have crisis stabilization, which is for 90 days, and that's our CBI level 3. So again, this is the same team, just depending on the range of time that they're offering the services. So ongoing consultation we ensure, and we ensure training, fidelity reviews, and all of these work really together in making sure that we really support our teams who are out there doing these services every day. And one of the things that we really do is outcomes, and we've really been emphasizing this in the last 2 years, which we use the CAFIS tool, which is a Child Adolescent Functional Assessment Scale, and that really gives us the outcomes measurement. And with this training curriculum, which we really use the fidelity monitoring that we have, so our fidelity reviews annually, we have our overview, and then we also really emphasize our risk and safety assessment and safety planning training, which is a refresher, which we require every year in addition to child and family teaming, because again, we really emphasize that collaboration across agencies. We really partner with our juvenile justice system as well as our child welfare and even our schools. One of the big things in the district is the expansion of our school-based behavioral health program. So we make sure that we really partner with them in offering CBI so that there is a continuum of services from in the school, but then also in the home, so making sure that there's collaboration there. So this is just an example of our trainings, but depending on the outcomes of our fidelity, and then just consultation and just our work with our providers and our agencies, we really adapt our trainings to the needs. And so also with this, like we were talking about, just with our practice, making sure that we really cover these areas with our core trainings. And we also have trainings for our supervisors, which we really, throughout the pandemic, really worked in. We're always revisiting how, the lay of the land is occurring, like what's going on right now. In the pandemic, it was a lot of emphasis around safety planning, crisis stabilization, really responsiveness to crisis. So we made sure that we really looked at all of our trainings and making sure that we really emphasize all these areas, cultural competency, and then making sure that we really build them up with the skills that they need.
Thank you, Amina. Yeah, so as you can see here that, we work very collaboratively in the district and in Ohio. And I think what we wanted to show in this slide is that, you may do different booster trainings every year to support staff based on whatever you're identifying. And these are just some of the curriculum that we've developed over the years based on what the providers are saying they need. And this year was a totally different need. It was, well, how do you do telehealth? How can you do home-based through telehealth? How do you monitor safety through telehealth? How do you do individual versus family therapy through telehealth? And so there was this, you had to turn on a dime and figure out very flexibly how to still help families, regardless of whether it was in person or not. And certainly it was quite the adaptation. And now we've got to figure out how do we get back in to the home and when does that occur? And what does our agency say about that? What's our state saying about that? And there could be very different, and what's the family say about that? Most importantly, they may be uncomfortable in having us return at this point into the home. So there's a lot that's going to be going on still this year around the adaptations and the transitions that we're asking of intensive home-based providers. We wanted to close out the workshop by just talking a little bit about workforce and some of the issues that some of the primary concerns that we're all experiencing in the behavioral health field, but in particular in any kind of home and community-based application. So we have thought a lot about this. Either we need to find trained professionals with comprehensive clinical skill sets. In other words, are there some existing folks that we can bring in? Or is this one strategy could be to go to pre-service, i.e. when the provider is still getting their graduate coursework or their undergraduate coursework. How do we insert our trainings or curriculum within that environment? So number one, somebody who's working on their master's in social work, for example, even knows that these services exist, and get them excited about them, and start talking about them. Because what we know is that traditional counseling, social work, psychology programs don't necessarily talk about intensive home-based treatment models or other home and community-based models. And then the other model is to do training post-service, which means the burden of the training falls on the supervisor and that agency to train and build the skills in the field. This is probably the most common method of training the workforce right now. So I want to acknowledge the supervisor's role in that, and to do that well. That's why we continue to say a dedicated supervisor to a program is important. And we recognize there's not only a workforce issue for direct care providers, there's also a workforce issue for supervisors as well. And so agencies tend to spread the supervisors a bit thin just to make things work. I mean, they're just trying to survive. But for these kind of programs, especially working with the level of concern, risk, safety issues that we encounter, you want to have that maximum role of supervisors involved, whether it's availability, intensive support, that whole idea of protected clinical supervision time, actually going into the field with the new clinicians, in helping them refine and master the skill sets that we're wanting them to have, because there's quite a few here. And then helping them gain that confidence in their craft. It's been my experience that the first year is the heaviest lift for new staff, and they're just learning everything and getting their footing. By the second year, they're feeling a whole lot more confident. By the third year, they think they can supervise the program. So, it's about a 3-year process, but after that first year, you're going to see a lot of reward for all that work you put in as a supervisor. I'm going to talk a little bit about workforce issues and let Amina also talk about what they've experienced in the district as well. We in Ohio have a lot of problem attracting, hiring, and sustaining licensed staff that want to do this work in the home and community. It could be just because of their concern about safety concerns in the home, like staff safety issues. It could just because of being on call and that's not appealing to them, or working with this population, working with kids versus adults. And so when you're coming out of school, you're defining who you're going to be as a professional, and oftentimes that just happens very naturally by the first job that you have. One of the things that I want to share in when we interview staff is that, yes, there could be some safety issues, but our job is to make sure that you feel confident enough, that you feel safe, that we're helping monitor your safety just as much as we're helping monitor the family's safety. That's number one. Number two, if we do our work intensively enough and we're checking in with families, they rarely would call for an emergency because we're meeting their needs and we're planning for the next needs. So the on-call stuff is there as a safety net to the families. But if it's done correctly, the service is done correctly, you probably won't get a lot of calls. The other issue is other child serving systems might offer more competitive salaries for similar degrees and qualifications. I know that's probably true in the district as much as anywhere else. Can you speak to that, what you guys are experiencing with that?
Yeah, so we're experiencing that as well because I referenced that we are having expansion with school-based behavior health. So that's another service that has the mental health element, but also we are really emphasizing fidelity to the model where we are emphasizing licensed staff to be able to be a part of these CBI teams. So really, we're really working with our providers on what's their plan to really recruit and really sustain. Recruiting and sustainability are two things in which our providers have challenges with. So we've been making sure they really utilize the consultation with the consultants. The consultants have more of a wider net of just knowledge. And then also we've even done it, we've opened up a work group, really working with our providers too, just so they can have some across agency support as well, because some agencies have some really great ideas of offering competitive salaries, offering incentives as well, and they've been able to really sustain their staff. So making sure that we really support them and really ensure that they're collaborating. That was one of the things from the pandemic, is that we resurfaced the CBI supervisory collaborative calls, so that the supervisors can really get together to really share ideas as well. Because we know that this is a challenge, and it's not only a challenge. We're happy to see it's not only a challenge in the district, but it's a challenge nationally as well.
And lastly, around workforce, we just want to emphasize that that supervisor position, that stability of that position, is key to program fidelity. We want the supervisor to be the holders of IHBT program fidelity, and so that in that the position is stable over time, you'll have a more stable program. I'm just going to end with a couple of slides on fidelity and outcomes. These are also listed in your program and practice standards. It's really important to be able to develop a set of standards that you can hold the agencies accountable to, in terms of, if we're implementing the model the way it's designed, what would it look like? What are kind of those acceptable standards and best practice standards and unacceptable standard practice as well? And so these are the items that go into the fidelity tool that we use both in the district and in Ohio. What I want to talk about just really briefly here, and let Amina also talk about, are key areas of model drift. And these are very common in terms of when models drift for home base, where that occurs. And so oftentimes the younger professional doesn't feel comfortable doing the family therapy yet, so they don't do it as much. So we see that. One of the other things that we have seen is they do great crisis work and great safety planning work, but you don't see evidence of it in terms of a completed safety plan. We also see in some places, longer lengths of stay based on, various issues. Did you want to talk about any of these as we today?
Yes, we've experienced, model drift in these areas, and so it's been like a gradual process of what we have really been addressing over the years. As we did the expansion in 2015, we really emphasized trainings, and then we really emphasized like the crisis and stabilization, and making sure that we really, family therapy, engagement, we really highlighted those in our trainings. Then we really went into the fidelity monitoring to ensure that even with the turnover in supervisors, what we referenced before, that there is that education and the training around the fidelity too. What are we really targeting? What are the really acceptable measurements, and what that looks like throughout the model? And so that has been a part of really how we have addressed the model drift, is really emphasizing those trainings, really emphasizing the fidelity monitoring tool, and then having offering and ensuring that consultation is ongoing. With the extended length of stay as well, that's one thing too, because we partner with child welfare, we partner with juvenile justice. So we know that a lot of our children in the service, they'll be in and out of placements. They'll be in and out of treatment. So how are we really addressing that as a system, and then how are we really supporting our providers? So it's really been more of a hands-on approach with our providers, but then also with our system and educating them as well. So we've really been busy in the district the last couple of years in addressing these targets.
Thank you, Amina. And just the last couple of slides address things like some of the outcomes that we feel really will reflect the efficiency and the effectiveness of your program, including, youth staying in the home, successful reunification, but also, all the behavioral health safety concerns that may have been stabilized, reduction in behavioral health symptomatology and things like that. And you want to pick a tool that measures what you do from start to finish. And so that's critical in terms of picking that tool. I've always liked the CAPAS in terms of a home-based measurement tool. It really measures really well what we do. And I'll close with these implementation lessons learned and turn it back over. So outcomes are needed for effective QI and QA. Pre-implementation is really important to convene meetings with community stakeholders so that you can establish the funding as well as the referral sources that are so critical to sustaining a program. You want to make sure that you have a forum for community feedback ongoing, and you want to be able to use that feedback to inform training and technical assistance, again, much like Amina discussed earlier. And Amina, do you have anything else on those final comments there?
Yes. So one of the in the last 2 years, so we really emphasize outcomes, and what we talked about was the CAFIS, and within the district, our mayor has a measurement called the Key Performance Indicators, and it's been around the high acuity youth, which is a majority of the children who are in community-based intervention services. And so the question is, how are they improving, and what percentage? And our goal has been 80%. And what is the percentage of our youth, high acuity youth, has improved with the CAFIS score? And so we've really been looking at that. We've really been looking at just how children in this particular service, how can we even be able to track some specific standards around how the children are doing. So we've really been able to see just some improvement over time. We're getting closer to the 80%, especially with a lot of the work with our providers and just internally with our data team, but really highlighting our high acuity youth and are they getting better? So our leadership is saying, like, what's the so what? We always emphasize utilization, how many kids are being served, but then so what? Are they actually getting better? So we've really been emphasizing outcomes, as well as along with that form of community feedback. So making sure we are re-engaging our stakeholders as we have really reviewed our regulations, really keeping those up to par with what our landscape, and ensuring that we have appropriate qualified staff to do this service as well.
Thank you, Amina. I just want to close with a comment to everyone listening, and that is, I'm very aware of when I travel through airports that there's big signs thanking the military and other folks for their service. And I'm also aware that I have a small pity party for myself, thinking, who's thanking us, right? So I really want to end with, we need to respect and honor our staff. And I want to thank all of you who are out there helping youth and families for your service. It may be the first time you've heard that from, because we don't say that a lot in the mental health field or the behavioral health field, but we need to begin. So thank you again for all of your time and all of your service, and be well.